Hello, everyone. This is an online version of the presentation that I gave last weekend at ITESOL, and it's a paper and a research project. Paper's not published yet, but hopefully it will be. Um, if some journal wants to pick up this fairly low-hanging fruit. Um, let's see. So I did a research project that looked kind of like this. Wait, no, this is the content slide. So I'm going to talk about my research project first and its results, and then the implications for teaching and writing. I presented this at ITESOL as teaching tips, so there has to be something for teachers to take away from it that they can do. I think even if you don't have that part tacked on at the end, the implications for teaching are pretty obvious from this research project. But let me tell you first what it is. It's a fairly, I think, normal error judgment survey plus interviews. What that means is I sent surveys to university faculty, non-ESL university faculty at the university where my IEP is, and asked them to judge student grammar errors from, let's see, the survey said they were from international students, and they had to judge them in these 5 different categories on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, meaning for example, I don't understand this at all versus I understand this completely, and that would have been the comprehensibility score. There was also acceptability. Acceptability just means the degree to which you believe that the utterance conforms to the standards of written English. And comprehensibility and acceptability are not necessarily the same thing. You can say like he eat Burger King every day, and most people wouldn't judge that acceptable, but they would judge it comprehensible, right? So there's also distraction, basically the extent to which the error distracts from the meaning of the utterance. There's irritation, just being annoyed by the utterance. And, this is an actual term of art in the error reaction literature. And then deduction. And this isn't as commonly explored, but I wanted to know which of these categories correlated most strongly with the tendency to ding students for the error. And the survey said explicitly that they were allowed to, like, assume that it's an assignment that you are allowed to ding for. And I wanted to see, was it irritation that best predicted deduction? Was it acceptability or, the opposite of acceptability that best predicted deduction, etc. Because I want to know, as an IEP teacher, what I'm preparing my students for. Am I preparing them to, let's see, would I be better training them to make no errors at all, which would be, more acceptable, obviously, or would I be better training them to, you know, pay attention to what the teacher wants them to do so as not to annoy them when they're grading your paper, right? These things are of interest to me as an IEP teacher because all of my students end up in other classes with people who don't teach ESL, right? So I also had different categories of error that all the errors were divided into, and the categories were not made explicit to the surveyees, but from my perspective, I had 2 of each kind of error total on the survey. If you're in the ESL world, you probably know what all of these are. Non-errors mean there's no error, obviously. Comma errors includes comma splices and things like let's see. I think they were mostly comma splices, or both of them were comma splices in my case. There were 2 kinds of spelling errors. One was non-standard spellings like native speakers often make, like THRU for through, or deletion or substitution, which are more like the errors that our students typically make because their first language isn't English. And again, I had 2 of each of these, and each one had the 5 reaction categories underneath it. So I was able to see with some precision what how people reacted to each of these different kinds of errors in which ways, right? So in the presentation at ITESOL, I asked people to say how they felt about this particular error, which is a sentence fragment or a subordinate clause or dependent clause standing as a sentence by itself. Most of them said that what did they say? They understood it. They didn't think it was acceptable. I don't think they were especially annoyed by it. Some of them, I think 1 or 2 people raised their hand for that. And most of them said that they would deduct. But of course, I was talking to ESL teachers at ITESOL, not to non-ESL faculty, which is the audience for the survey. And here's another one. I asked the audience to react to this. This time, some more people were a little bit annoyed because there's this red underline. The red underline, in my mind, and I think the ESL teachers probably felt the same way, says to the student that they should fix it, even if they don't see the error, then they know that an error is there and there's something to fix. And on the actual survey, of the two errors of each type that were presented, one of them was presented with an underline, which was added artificially with Adobe Photoshop. And I wanted to see if that underline would goose a particular type of reaction. Most of the time in modern teaching contexts, when we're having students turn things in on multiple drafts, they're doing so with text editors, and most of them have, well, most of them meaning Google Docs and Microsoft Word both have these automatic red underlines that appear over errors. It could facilitate a particular type of reaction if you think that students are neglecting to proofread their own work or neglecting to revise their own work. And I'll tell you later what that red underline actually produced as far as the results of the survey. Anyway, I only had 23 people take the survey, and about half were from the English department, and quite the humanities in general were overrepresented. The interviews were a little bit more balanced, just because I could choose who I asked want to do an interview with, and I didn't want all English department people. And again, I'm in an IEP that's not in the English department, but it's mostly English department people who are the non-ESL teachers on campus who are interested in taking a survey on grammar. So they tended to respond more than other people. I'm not complaining because this is better than having like 15 respondents who are not from the English department, but the English department was very I should say, generous with their time and generous with the willingness to share my survey with other people in their department. Anyway, so this is the results of the survey at a kind of a 30,000 feet level. Basically, which error category had the highest reaction of this type. So the ones judged the most comprehensible were the article errors, which is interesting to me because those were also errors of a kind, whereas no error was judged the most acceptable. Interestingly, no error was not judged the most comprehensible, which means people saw sentences with some error and then I think tried to make sense of it and realized that they could make sense of it and then judged it to be more comprehensible for that reason. The no error sentences might have been, I don't know, less comprehensible for non-error reasons, just maybe the content was a little bit difficult. And if you want to see a copy of the survey, you can always email me. This is going on YouTube, so I guess leave a comment. The survey is closed, by the way, but you can still look at it. So the non-standard spellings were just the most distracting. And interestingly, again, this is a native speaker type of error. So people are used to seeing these kinds of errors even from well, as I guess, especially from non-international students, and have a particular kind of reaction to it. The fragments were deemed the most annoying or irritating, and the fragments were also the most deducted. So, if you want to train, speaking as an IEP instructor, if you want to train people not to lose points for grammar, fragments seem to be the best thing to focus on. Or at least they tended to get the highest deductions, right? So small caveat though, or I guess medium-sized caveat, the highest negative reaction was still below 3 on average. And again, this was a Likert scale of 1 to 5. So that means the strongest negative reaction was less than a medium level reaction, right? Less than 3. So that means people regarded no error at all as okay, and an error as okay, right? So not strongly negative in any case, right? So when I say that, the strongest tendencies to deduct were for fragments, that tendency was still less than 50% of the possible scale that I was asking them to use to judge how much they would how likely they would be to deduct. Okay. Also, the underlines didn't seem to make a difference. And I should caveat this because there was data from the interviews that sort of contradicted this point, but at least on the survey, in a very abstract and artificial situation, which is a survey about grammar errors, people did not say that they would be more likely to deduct if the error was presented with a red underline, which is interesting, right? Also, deduction was very highly correlated with distraction. I said earlier that irritation was, let's see, fragments were the most irritating and the most likely to be deducted, but the category that was most highly correlated with deduction, meaning people who said something was people who said something was likely to be deducted also reacted very strongly in this way. That other way was distraction. So if they thought something was distracting, they were more likely to say that it was also deductible. But again, the average score was below 3 out of 5. Okay. So again, fragments, things that are distracting. What was the distracting thing? Like non-standard spellings. Those are things that might cost your students points in the future. Okay. Also, the surveys were pretty consistent in their responses. So the average was what it was, but each individual professor tended to give responses that were pretty similar to their responses to other items. So like if I thought that fragments were annoying, I tended also to think that non-standard spellings were annoying. If I thought that, a comma error was acceptable, then I also tended to think that a fragment was acceptable, right? So if someone gave 2 to one item, they were likely to give 2 to many other items. If someone gave 4 to an item, they were likely to give 4 to other items. What this means in plain English is that um, when students enroll in a class, that professor's grading is likely to be pretty consistent regardless of the type of error that the students are making. And I guess one would hope regardless of the individual student making the error. But a different professor's class is likely to be pretty different, and that professor is likely to be consistent in different ways, right? I don't know why I have a picture of a robot. I guess because it's very consistent. Yes, that's why I put that there. So another caveat, I'm using the word caveat a lot in this presentation. The reactions have to be seen in the light of the artificiality of the survey, because when people were invited to sort of elaborate on the responses and maybe imagine the student that had submitted an essay or a paragraph with these errors, they were more likely to take a um, punitive attitude under certain circumstances, and almost, not very much in the survey. I had a hard time getting very punitive reactions from any item in the survey, but in interviews, they said specifically that they would not penalize people on first drafts, and almost everyone said that. They don't like penalizing people for first drafts, and often first drafts are just give me points. Like if you turn it in, you get 100% no matter what. But if they see the same error in multiple drafts, especially when there's been specific feedback given about that error, then they're likely to take a punitive attitude and penalize the error, even if it's not, I don't know. This didn't really come up in the surveys, but regardless of what kind of error it was, they didn't like that students didn't react to feedback. So this was a typical quote regarding first drafts. And, they say, I'm increasingly moving away from grammar as a punitive thing in writing. Almost, I think maybe 100% of the interviews said something like this, especially about first drafts. Now, as we got into sort of the nitty-gritty of what if the same student, what if you saw this error on a subsequent draft and it had been underlined already in the first draft, then their attitude changes quite a bit and they get explicitly punitive, right? So the faculty that I interviewed said things like this. Sometimes I just think they're being lazy. Again, that's a quote. One of the interviewees said exactly that. And another said, if I have marked stuff and they don't make any changes between the draft and the final draft, that's a problem for me. So again, the caveat is errors presented they weren't presented in isolation, they were presented as parts of paragraphs, but when they see the error and they don't know who wrote it, they don't know, they can't see the person's face, they don't know that person's work habits, they don't have any other relevant information about that person, they tend to be pretty lenient. But when they know the person who turned it in and they know the feedback they gave them and they see that the feedback has been ignored, their attitude changes a lot, right? And they get a lot more explicitly punitive, right? So this comports with what's been found in previous error reaction research, which is basically that it's part of a kind of a social interaction between the teacher and the student, the professor and the student. And it has to be seen as a type of social interaction rather than a pure reaction to linguistic form. I think pretty early on in the literature, people established that it wasn't a pure reaction to form, but something that's been, I think, becoming more common, especially since the 80s, is people saying, well, maybe this isn't really about form at all. Maybe it's about what I think about the person making the error, and the error is like some indirect evidence of what I think of that person, right? So you can see the quote from Santos here, more or less saying that at least, let's see. So as regards international student errors, it's often a transfer of attitudes that people have towards native speakers who make similar errors. Basically, that if they make errors, they're being lazy, and especially if they make the same error multiple times after it's been corrected, then they're being lazy. And that's the thing that they're punishing rather than the error, rather than the form of the error itself. Right. So as for the teaching tips segment of this presentation, as a teacher, what I take away from it is that I really should focus more on the process of revision rather than the final product. Professors are very likely to notice an error that's been highlighted and then not fixed in a final draft, even if most of the paper is pretty good, right? So the process of error correction is to some degree more important than the process of turning in a perfect draft, or I guess the product at the end of the revision process. So basically, and I already do this, but I think more people should do this, is always give multiple drafts. Anything that's written in class and it's not explicitly, because again, we're ESL teachers, not explicitly to test someone's impromptu, I guess, level of interlanguage and the kind of grammar that they can produce under time constraints. Any large writing assignment should be submitted more than once, and then you should give at least part of the grade just for revision, right? Not for how perfect the assignment gets when the student takes it home and has time to look at it over a long period of time. And again, well, this is from a different presentation, but you don't know what's actually happening to the draft between when the student takes it home and when they bring it back. It might not necessarily be their interlanguage level that's responsible for the changes that are happening to the draft. Anyway, so it's more important to give feedback than grades for first drafts. Again, most of the professors I talk to don't really give grades at all to first drafts. It's just if you turned it in, you got the points. So what's more important is giving feedback, because that will be how you judge how they respond to feedback on subsequent drafts. And then, yeah, so on a very nuts and bolts point, if you have an LMS like Canvas or Blackboard, I don't know anyone who uses Blackboard anymore, but if you're one of the few people who still uses that, it's worth giving a separate assignment just for revision, or even multiple assignments for different types of revision, say peer revision, show this to a classmate and then reflect on what they told you, go to the writing center, reflect on what they told you. What is the most common error that the professor highlighted in your work? What do you think about that error? What will you do to, focus on to improve that skill in the future? It's worth giving separate points for all of those things, because again, in the future, professors will just expect them to do this. And also, if you don't give the points, students probably just won't do them. All right, here are my references, and here's a QR code where you can access these slides if you like. And I'll see you later.